Okay. We are back from the coffee, and we resume the talks. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Kirk Johnson, which is a geologist, paleobotanist, and the Sun Director of the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History since 2012. So it's been quite a long. His PhD from Yale University, and was previously the Vice President of the Denver Museum of Natural Science. His research focused on fossil plants and the extinction of the dinosaurs. That's quite a big mixture, no? And he's known from his scientific articles, popular books, museum exhibitions, documentaries, collaborations with artists, and today for coming late to all the photographs. Apart from that, you're welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Rafi. And thanks for the invitation to this meeting. It's really exciting to be here in Madrid and celebrate the 250th anniversary of a really great idea, the idea of natural history museums. They're incredible organizations, and 250 years pretty much takes us back to the beginning of them. I mean, there were collections beforehand, but this, just thinking a quarter of a millennium that humans have been collecting objects from the natural world to understand the world and their place in it. And here we are at the 250th year of it. Rafi gave me this title, The Role and Opportunities of a National Museum. So it's fun to receive the title to your talk and then build the talk to the title. And I think a lot about natural history museums. I would say that I've become a real aficionado of natural history museums, and to think back about them, how when I first encountered them as a child, I thought these things have been around here forever. But they haven't been around that long, really. If you look at this chart, this just shows, it's hard to read the numbers at the bottom, but there you go, Madrid in 1771. And you can see that there was a real burst of natural museums built in the last part of the 19th century, between 1880 and 1920. So all the big ones in the world really came in the 19th century. And I've plotted them against human population. So all the big natural museums were built between the time when there were 1 billion people on the planet and 2 billion people on the planet. When I made this chart, there were 7 billion people on the planet. And that chart is 12 years old, and now there's 8 billion people on the planet. So we're now at a place where, my mother was born when there was 2 billion people on the planet. I was born when there was 3 billion. Now there's 8 billion. And that says it all, pretty much. We have this interesting, curious kind of organization, the Natural History Museum, that was built to understand our place in the natural world. And suddenly we have experienced what's called the Great Acceleration. You can see that curve tip up very rapidly after World War II, the globalization of the planet and the growth of the human population. We know over the next 2 or 3 decades, we'll see another 2 billion people. We'll approach 10 billion people on the planet. And then something will happen, demographics show us leveling out and starting to go back down. But truly, we're at perhaps the most critical point in human history for sure, and perhaps one of the most critical points in planetary history. Is this going to be the 6th extinction or not? I mean, we're well into it. Right now, the extinction is being driven largely by human activities directly. Devastation of ecosystems, harvesting of fish and animals. But as climate change starts to bite in, we'll have a secondary impact that's driving extinction. And we could indeed see the demise of the ice sheets and the commencement of dead oceans. So what's amazing to me about this is that we're at a point in time where we actually have a choice about the future we want. And humans have been very clever at developing all sorts of ideas and concepts and tools and technologies. And in fact, we've built the technologies that has literally changed the composition of the atmosphere and is driving the climate. So we're a fairly clever bunch of monkeys. And we actually have the ability to forethought. And we're at a moment now where we have this tool called the Natural History Museum. It's a 19th century tool, but I'm pretty convinced it was built for the 21st century. I'm pretty convinced that the people who built it were thinking, humans in nature, what's going to happen? And here we are. So all of us are very lucky, or not very lucky, if you want to think about it that way, to be at the peak of our own professional careers at the moment when the planet has a choice. There's never really been a moment like this before on the planet, and we're facing it. So the next 2 decades, and you run the museums of the world, I run a big museum, I think we are potentially part of the solution set for the 21st century, but only if we choose to be. And the conversations that were had earlier today were very encouraging because we're seeing for the first time natural history museums are really beginning to work together. We've been traditionally isolated reefs in the middle of a big ocean, a museum over there, one over there, and there's not many big natural history museums in the world. There's only about 110 very large natural history museums. There's thousands of small ones, but collectively the collections are housed mainly in the large ones, mainly in capital cities, mainly in Europe and North America. And we've been collecting these objects with the idea they have a purpose. We're at that moment now. So it really is important, and I was very heartened by Edwin's presentation, his methodical way of thinking through what do we need, how do we deliver what we need with the Natural History Museum. And obviously there'll be other people on the planet that are working to solve the challenges of this century, but we're natural history people. This is our tool. Here's what we have to do. I will say that it's sort of shocking to think back about this because I think in terms of museums, I used to think they were from a long time ago, but I realized that like my museum, which opened in 1910, my grandfather was 31 years old when it opened. So it's not that long ago. And flip it forward, 80 years from now, we'll be in the 22nd century. We'll have been over the top of the peak human and back down into whatever world we're in at that point in time. Many children who are alive now will be alive in the year 2100. They'll be citizens of the 22nd century. So this is not a thing for your grandchildren. This is a thing for you and your children. And it's just very compelling to have these conversations about natural history museums at this moment in the planet's history. So, we've always had sort of just 3 things we did. It's a pretty simple idea. I mean, it's tricky from the point of view of a mission because we have sort of 3 different missions. We do scientific research, we curate and use collections, and we educate and entertain audiences. That's it, 3 different things. Those 3 things make museums sometimes sources of conflict because there's 3 different missions. Your collections people are working hard on the collections, your researchers are doing their research, your audience people are educating the audience, they're fighting over the resources. They should all be working together in the same way that all museums should be working together. But these 3 things, the 3-legged stool as it was called, I just call it new knowledge, valued objects, communication. Those 3 functions were clearly defined at the beginning. Here's George Brown Goode, who was the first director of the Smithsonian's Natural History Museum. He served from 1881 to 1896. He's 25 directors before me, if you go back. We had a lot of directors over the last century. He said 3 museums should have 3 parallel missions: specimen preservation, scientific research and publication, and public education. Great, that's what we do. We all agree with that. And it had been for the last 100 years or so, running a natural history museum, you were doing one of these 3 things, kind of working along. Natural history museums, the last big ones, were built by the 1920s. We stopped building natural history museums for the rest of the century and ended up letting them wind down. So lots of natural history museums have decayed infrastructure. We heard this morning from Alexander Kellner about the museum in Rio that burned to the ground, mainly because they just had not been able to get the money to maintain the infrastructure. And lots of our museums have this problem. They're old buildings. They're 100-year-old buildings, deferred maintenance. They fall apart. But the 20th century was a rough century too. You look at lots of museums were destroyed in warfare and in action. And even this week, we saw the bombing of museums in Kyiv in Ukraine. So museums in capital cities are where we store the treasures of our planet, but they're also places that become endangered by neglect or by malice. So does this little model work for us now? Is this the model we need to move forward into the next 2 or 3 decades where we have to deploy our thoughts to move museums forward? And I would say generally yes, but there have been sort of 3 major factors that have moved into this space and complicated it. And for most of the conversations I had with Natural History Museum directors, it's not this core mission that's confusing, it's the complicating factors that come from these 3 new arenas. And of course, the first one is the Anthropocene. Look at it as you may, it's the actual activity of a growing human population, its stress on resources, the impacts on climate change and global warming, the resulting biodiversity loss. There's other things like disinformation or food security, pandemics. We all have our own long list. You can do the long list of the impacts of humanity. I don't need to report them to you. And most people are more or less aware of them if you're a scientist or paying attention. But in general, I think what's happening is almost everybody in the world's aware of it in the form of just pure anxiety right now. Even people who don't understand what's going on feel really anxious. You talk to kids right now, and they're really unhappy about the world. If you ask them to articulate, they might say, "You've given us a raw deal. You've given us a world that was different than the world you were given," which is true. And so that's a big issue because we have to say, can we use natural history museums to do anything about this at all? This is a huge global problem. We're just a few hundred buildings in a capital cities, a few thousand people that work in natural history museums. But I think we can. I think we should. But that's not the only challenge we have. There's also this issue of the new world of science. Science has changed profoundly. And we see this in the natural history museum context because many of our scientists are still in the 19th century. Some are in the 20th century, some in the 21st century. It's a mix. Because as these incredible technologies come online, you have so many more ways of interrogating the data that are in the collections that we all see this. We see the spectrum of people who are thinking about things the way people thought about them in 1920, or people might think about them in 2050. And it causes a challenge for us in terms of financing science. You don't know what bets to place. What kind of expensive equipment do you buy? Where do you keep your data? Yes, we'd like to digitize things, but how do you do that? How do you digitize millions of objects? So this big data thing provides huge opportunity, yet tremendous challenge. And if you think about it in terms of the exhibit part of the organization, so many times we've tried to install digital assets in the public side of the house only to realize we bought the wrong technology and money was wasted. There's a lot of digital shipwrecks in the museum landscape where people invested money in equipment and they weren't able to achieve the goals they wanted. So there's lots of like, let's put this. It's like, oh, we don't want to be the bleeding edge. So that's a really important point. And Edwin really spoke about the big data science as a tool to help solve the Anthropocene challenge. But he didn't talk about the third element, which is this. It's sort of the cultural reckoning of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was where it all came together, where we had this incredible realization that rational thought and information about the natural world to help us understand what's going on this planet. At the same time, we were colonizing parts of the world. We were displacing indigenous peoples across the world. We were making our collections on the boot marks of those activities. So our collections are challenged. We have objects that we probably need to return to source communities because they were unethically collected. We have literally thousands of bodies of individuals who didn't consent to be part of our collections. So we've got this great big challenge of the Anthropocene and the options of big data science. We also have the reckoning of the cultural contents of our collections. And it's not trivial, and we can't ignore it. So you have the challenges of those things pushing and pulling. So here we have the standard old model, the Natural History Museum, and you have these three new things. And all three of these things really came to the fore in the last couple of decades. If you were working in natural history museums 20 or 30 years ago, you were thinking about other things, but the climate became very apparent, population spiked up, big data came online, the digital revolution, and the cultural reckoning is happening in full force even as we speak. It happens in different ways in different countries, but it's all these three things are in play. So now you have these three factors impinging on your ability to do a heroic task and make a natural history museum a tool for good, a part of the solution set for the 21st century. So it's tough. I was asked to talk about the role and opportunities of national museums. Good topic. 10 years ago, I took the job of being the director of a national museum of the richest nation in the world. So I should be thinking about that topic on a regular basis, as I do. And there's lots of different kinds of museums, right? And some of these overlap. Like you can have museums that are university museums, also a state museum, or a city museum that's also a national museum. Lots of people have personal museums. There are privately owned museums. There are literally museums of all kinds. And you have to ask the question, what does that mean? We all saw the definition of the ICOM, new ICOM definition of museums earlier today, and it's a very long, elaborate definition. Basically, for public good, the keeping of collections and interpretation for the public good. But different kinds of museums have different mandates and different oversight, different ways, different degrees of freedom in which they can operate. And often we find museums are held within organizational structures. University museums often have a difficult time because they're sort of the odd organization out within a university that's all around undergraduate education. State museums are often limited in their scope to working within the state. City museums come and go with the factors that support the funding of city museums. And national museums often act at the whims of the national politics. Which leads me to the Smithsonian, where I'm the director of the Natural History Museum. This is an interesting institution. It's really the United States' first national bet on science. And it came together due to an individual named James Smithson, who died in 1829. He left in his will his fortune to the United States for the founding of an institution in the city of Washington whose purpose is the increase and diffusion of knowledge. Very much a Enlightenment reason to do it. And here he is, James Smithson, lovely guy, gave us 500,000 gold crowns, came to the United States. The money got there in 1835. The Congress promptly spent it, squandered it away. Then they realized they had to do the job, so they get the money back. And in 1846, they started the Smithsonian. And the interesting thing is nobody knows why James Smithson did that. There's really no knowledge at all why he gave that money to the United States. But we do have an idea, and it's an interesting idea. It turns out that James Smithson was in the same place at the same time on 4 occasions with Alexander von Humboldt. And the Smithsonian smells like a Humboldtian organization. It smells like a Humboldtian idea. And we have no idea if this is true or not, but von Humboldt, when he came to the States very briefly in 1802, visited Thomas Jefferson, the president, who was also a naturalist and a paleontologist. All presidents should be paleontologists, by the way. And had a conversation. He was urging Jefferson to build a national museum in Washington. And Jefferson said, the government will never pay for that. I can never get that across Congress. It'll never happen. So what Smithson did was effectively circumvent the lack of congressional support. The money came. The United States had its museum. And here it was, the first building opened in 1855 on the National Mall. Here's a painting showing Washington, D.C. around then, just before the Civil War. And after today, I actually pondered the fate of the Smithsonian had the American Civil War turned out differently, looking at the perturbations that happened here in Spain with the Spanish Civil War and how these perturbations challenge things. You know, Washington, D.C. almost was taken by the Confederacy on a couple of occasions. So there could have been a different outcome, but the Union won, and President Lincoln prevailed, and Washington, D.C. was never taken by the rebels. But here's Washington, D.C. in 1855, and here it is today. And I was visited by a friend from France who told me, it's amazing how your government wraps itself in museums. And that's what Washington, D.C. is. It's the seat of government. It's the capital city. And the Smithsonian is there with its 20 museums, 8 research centers, and the National Zoo. So you can see that the government literally is wrapped in museums. It's wrapped in knowledge containers about history, art, culture, and science. And here they are. 2 of them were just authorized. 2 of them don't exist yet. The National Museum of the American Latino and the National American Women's History Museum. Both of those were passed by Congress in the beginning of end of 2019. And the way it works is that the U.S. government can tell us to build a museum. Museums cost about $1 billion right now. They'll pay for half. So they told us, build 2 new museums, we'll pay for half, which means we have to raise $1 billion from private sources in the United States to build these museums. We've already got the director of the new American Latino Museum. We're still searching for the president for the American Women's History Museum. And we've hired the boards. We're in the process of selecting a site on the National Mall to install these 2 new museums. But imagine if you were going about your business trying to save the world with your museum, and someone said, oh, by the way, raise an extra $1 billion and build 2 museums, largely to address that whole cultural reckoning element, right? We're talking about the melting pot of America, and We've already built the National Museum of the American Indian and the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And there's likely to be a National Museum of Asian Pacific American Culture as well. So it's interesting in this context of the Natural History Museum to be realizing you're part of the Smithsonian Institution. Our governance is very bizarre. My boss is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts. The regents include the Vice President of the United States, 3 senators, 3 congressmen, and 9 civilians. So 9 civilians are pretty much high-functioning risk takers. And the 8 elected or appointed officials are very much not risk takers. So you have a board of regents that is very much deadlocked at all times in terms of decision-making, except for the announcement of new museums that we have to build. But here it is. This is the place I inherited. This is the National Museum of Natural History. It's by most measures, the largest natural history museum in the world. Here's the picture taken in 2010 when it was celebrating the 100th anniversary of this building. And this is the staff and building I inherited. This building opened when my grandfather was 1931. My mom visited when she was 9 years old in 1939. So in a way, it's been here forever, and it's been here 2 of my family generations. I knew my grandfather, I knew my mom, so it's really kind of not that old of a building. When I was a kid, I started a personal museum in my bedroom in 1968, and I moved my father out of his home in 2017. So my personal museum was 48 years old, and the National Museum was only 100 years old, so time flies. You know, it's like we tend to think these big entities are around forever, but they're actually not. They're just a few generations back for us, which means they're ephemeral too. There's nothing that says natural history museums are going to be surviving or successful unless we make them survive and be successful. Here's the reason I came to Washington. I was at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science as a curator. I've been there for 22 years. It was a fabulous job. I enjoyed my life a lot in the Rocky Mountains. I could get in a car and drive out of the building and drive to a fossil site in 20 minutes. We were finding dinosaur skeletons in downtown Denver. It was a paleontology paradise. The Smithsonian called up and said, "Would you like to be the director of the National Museum?" And I was like, no, I don't want to do that. But then I thought about it, and I realized this one amazing fact. This museum is a national museum. It gets most of its visitors from the nation. It gets a lot of local visitors, and it gets some international visitors. But by and large, 70% of the visitors come from the nation. So who's this museum for? It's really for the people of the nation. And we're getting between 4.5 and 6 million visitors a year, which means that over a decade we'd see about 46 million people. Most of them coming once in a decade, which means in a decade, in that building, we see 40 million unique people. That's 12% of the United States population. That's 12% of 330 million people. And if you believe, like I believe, that natural history museums can impact people, and someone said, would you run a museum that will see 40 million unique visitors in the next decade? You can't say no. Like, you can't be true to yourself and say no, because I myself was impacted by being a natural history kid, and I've seen people who are leading scientists who tell me, I became a scientist because I went to a natural history museum and I had this momentary experience. It's not like education. Education, you go to school all year long and you hate it. Museums, you go and you're a kid, you love it, and for some people, it's a life-changing experience. And if you have 40 million people a decade coming through, and you can give some percentage of them a life-changing experience, that's pretty cool impact. The fact this museum is free entry, and that we can see 40 million people in the building. This is one of the big challenges I see with a lot of the European museums is, for whatever reason, American museums tend to be more visited. The big ones are more visited than the European museums. And that's a challenge. I mean, obviously, London and Paris have high attendance, but some of the other museums are lower attendance, less than 1 million kind of visitors, even in very large cities. And I think that's a challenge. If we want to be impactful as not just museums, we do have to increase the throughput of visitors. We have to get more people coming, because if people aren't there and they don't see what we're doing, then how does it matter? We have to be a place where people come. It helps that we're free. We get an amazing federal subsidy every year. So my money just comes out of the sky like manna. And because the National Mall is a pilgrimage spot, my visitors show up by the thousands. So all I have to do is open my doors, people flow in, money flows in. It's actually an extraordinarily easy museum to run. I didn't realize it would be that easy because, you know, the water The water, the people flow like water, the money flows like water, and the basic operations, I literally don't have to do anything. I have a no marketing department. I don't even have to do any budgeting. The money just comes in a check, the people just come on the day, and there it is. So it's location, location, location on the National Mall. It's an amazing situation. Behind the scenes lives this most remarkable collection, 147 million objects, by far and away the largest museum collection in the world, from pretty much everywhere in the world, except it looks like Russia, for reasons that are pretty obvious. And it's an amazing collection that was made over a long period of time by, in large, the US government, which has been all over the world for the last 100 years. Our earliest collections come from the 1830s from the US exploring expedition, which is a circum-global expedition of six ships that sailed around the world and just sort of doing a Darwin-like exploration of the world. Little known expedition because they didn't really produce any fabulous science at the end of the day. They had a good trip and brought back a lot of cool collections. And this suite of collections also manifests the fact that many of the US federal science agencies are based or were formed in the Smithsonian. So the US Department of Agriculture, the US Geological Survey, the NOAA Fisheries Actions, many of those federal science agencies were founded in or at the Smithsonian, and many of them still have staff and collections in the Smithsonian. It turns out that I manage about 2 million square feet of buildings, and in that area I have 45 tenant organizations, of which a dozen are federal agencies. So I have people from the Federal Aeronautics Administration who are working on bird strikes. I've got people from the Department of Defense who are working on mosquitoes. I've got the people looking at invasive pests. I've got the fisheries people from NOAA. Anybody who works with natural history collections in the federal government is basically embedded in the Natural History Museum. So the role of a Natural History Museum is a deep intertwining with federal science, which is both good and bad because our federal science budget whipsaws back and forth with different administrations. And we have, for the last 17 years, only 2 years have I received my budget at the beginning of the year. So we usually go through the first few months of the year on faith that we'll get our money. And it comes, usually, so life is good. The collections are remarkable, and they're well housed. We have the expansive budget of the federal government has bought for us many large modern facilities to keep collections in top conditions. So I often visit collections and I say, oh man, you've never had federal investment. You never had large non-private investment in your collections care and preservation because it's hard to get money to take care of collections in city museums and state museums and private museums. In a national museum, the way it's structured, you can actually pay for the maintenance of collections. So we have an off-site storage area that's about 1 million square feet, built in 1984, state-of-the-art. We're building additions onto that. You can see the nature of our collection. Here's our mineral collection and our fossil collection and old carriers, our bird collection. These are all pre-rehousing. These have all been rehoused. Our mammal collection, which has very surprising sights occasionally, the National Whale collection, the insect collection, mollusk collection. It goes on and on. It's just like it's what I would say it's the closest thing to infinity I've ever seen. And I have my greatest temporary possession in life is the one key that I have, which is the number 1 key, which opens all the doors. And I'm the curator of all this collection. It's a remarkable privilege to be in this spot and help steward this collection forward. And of course, the challenge is really, how do we do those 3 basic metabolic things, the collections, the research, and the audience, in the light of the Anthropocene, new science, and cultural reckoning? That's the challenge. And it's a remarkable challenge because you have many people who have devoted their lives to various aspects of this challenge. And it's so fun to listen to Edwin talk because he runs what I would call a very nimble museum. It's in a very nimble country. So he can pivot and make choices and make decisions very rapidly that are bets on the future. He can build an exhibit, he can build a museum and see how it works. I'm a little bit more like an aircraft carrier or a microcontinent or something like that. For me to pivot direction at the Smithsonian is very challenging given all the pre-existing commitments and challenges that we have. But we continue to do the basic stuff, the acquisition of large numbers of collections. And I will say that if we believe that collections matter because they existed in the past, then we have to believe that making collections in the future matters as well, especially in a time of dramatic change on the planet. So we're actively collecting. And in the 10 years that I've been here, we've acquired a host of amazing, iconic objects like this little Don horse, one of the most perfect fossils ever found in North America, or this mega mouth shark, or this incredible 8,000-pound block of crystals from Arkansas, or this 10,000 carat aquamarine. But we also get large orphan collections. And so we grow in great leaps and bounds by acquiring orphan collections. Here's a collection of 1,100 cases, 1 million fossils from the U.S. Geological Survey that rotated back to us. So we have to be able to absorb huge volumes of collections and take care of them. This is a brand new facility we just opened. Here's the number. In the last decade, we added almost 18 million specimens to our collection. Now, 18 million would be a big museum all by itself. This is the last decade's intake. So we are collecting, and not profligate. These are collections that merited being in the national collection that are part of the solution set for the 21st century. And thanks to Pinturai and Leiden for leading the way and teaching us how to digitize in bulk large collections. And we just finished digitizing the 5 million specimen National Herbarium just 2 months ago. And last week we just finished digitizing all of our dragonflies and odonata. Digitization is an interesting beast. It's expensive, it's time consuming. Some things we don't know how to digitize yet. We don't know how to digitize pickled jars of jellyfishes very well, for instance. And how do we actually make our collections accessible? We kind of all know in our heart of hearts that this will happen. Collections will become digitally accessible in the future. The question is really, is the future 10 years from now or 50 years from now? We know that the way that the digital world is changing so rapidly that we'll get there. But this is a question, like if we want to get somewhere in 2 decades, how fast do we have to go to get there? So this is a question for all of us as we think about accessing and making our collections digitally accessible. You saw great talks today about CTAF and the DISCO project, where the European museums are working very well together to talk about how they coordinate all their entire collections. I think this needs to be a global effort. I frankly really think that we are on the cusp of taking these isolated reefs of museums and pulling them together. And at very least, we can add together the impact of the museums. My goal in some way would be to multiply the impact of museums. Are there ways that us working together can greatly accelerate, not just add ourselves together, but multiply our impacts? Certainly, collectively, we hold what humanity has collected in the last 250 years to understand the planet, and now's the moment. So it's time for us to cooperate aggressively, take advantage of the opportunities of technology, and move forward. So here's just another view of what was called the digital twin, this idea that every object has the cloud of information around it. Right now, it's very difficult to associate that information with the objects. So we do all this scientific research on the collections, and yet often we don't even know what the results of the research are. We were seeing about 12,000 visiting scientists a year at the Smithsonian, at Natural History Museum collection alone. They were publishing hundreds of papers, and we would never see those papers. So we don't even have the ability to link back to the research that's being done on our collections, unless it's research that's done by our own researchers. So that needs to be solved. This is hard to see from the distance, but one of the things that we discovered several years ago when we started having pan-Atlantic conversations between European directors and North American directors was that as directors, we agreed that our key asset were our collections, but it was the Tower of Babel. We couldn't talk to each other. You know, Bruno could tell me, yes, I've got 70 million specimens in 16 departments. And I could say, well, I've got 147 million collections in 7 departments. But that was about it. Like, we couldn't link it. And of course, our collections were not digitized, so we couldn't compare our collections at all. And we thought, we've got to solve that. And we thought, you know, there's all these efforts to digitize collections, really good work being done by Bio and DISCO and these other groups who's focusing on getting the granular per specimen data out of collections. And we're like, you know, we need to hack this and shortcut it. We need a very fast way of estimating what we have in our collections so that we can compare it. So we got a group of 12 leading scientists from 12 large museums together and said, look, just for the sake of a quick survey, can you give us a grid that has less than 400 cells, that on one axis has a number of collections that you all agree what would fall into those collections. And the other axis, geographic regions that break the world up into known areas. And so they came back with this 19 different kinds of collections, 16 geographic regions. The resulting grid means that an item in the collection would fall into only one of the grid cells, right? So it's a 304 cell grid that shows that any object in any collection in the world would fall into one of those cells. And we knew it would be suicide to ask our collection managers to give us the number of specimens in each cell, because they would revolt and say, we were not digitized, we can't do that. So we made it much easier for them. We said, like, the nearest power of 10, what do you got? Do you have less than 1,000 or more than 10,000 insects from Africa? That's pretty easy exercise. It turns out for the Smithsonian, I'm just showing the grid for the National Museum of Natural History, we did this in 2 weeks, the assessment. So you were plotting the log base 10 number of samples in each of the grid cells, and you can see where we're strong and where we're weak. And there's a flash, a heat map of the collection. And we then did it for about a dozen museums, found that was pretty easy. So we reached out to the 116 of the largest museums in the world and said, will you give us a week of your time and see how this works? And of those, 73 got back to us. And the way we selected was in North America and Europe, we're really looking for the largest collections, that is more than 10 million specimens. Anywhere else in the world, they said if you have more than 1 million specimens, you're in the count. And we got this resulting 73. So this is the first approximation of the contents of the global collection. Sometime a decade from now or 5 decades from now, when we're fully digitized, you can hit a button and get the same answer. But we're going to give you a number that is accurate but not precise about what we hold in our collections. So this is a pretty cool project. This is something that's underway right now, but it's the first step towards a global collaboration. And I stress this point, at the level of the directors of the museum, because most of their collaborations are at the level of these curators and collection managers. And having been a collection manager, having been a curator, I know that I didn't have a lot of power in my organization. And often my initiatives would go so far and they'd stop. So when I became a director, I'm like, we have to hit this from the top and the bottom. We have to have collaboration between the curators and the directors so that the museums don't have an internal administrative impediment for seeking improvement and use of the collections. And so this is this sort of top-down, bottom-up view, and it was delightful to see what's going on the granular level here, and same with iDigBio, as we start to pull together what this one world collection looks like, what this global collection looks like. So there's also the ongoing research, and this is an interesting challenge because as new science comes online, many scientists come on board with the idea to do science, but maybe not collection-based science, which is an interesting direction, right? You have sort of people who are doing less field work, they're not going out and exploring places. The world, as we've heard, is like vastly underexplored in every dimension. The biological, paleontological, archaeological realms of the world have huge amounts of exploration to be done. And if we don't have the people in the field doing the actual primary work, we're never really going to grow our understanding of the planet Earth, even though we might get tremendous analytics on what we have in our collections. Or we may hire the scientists who are fabulous scientists who could also be just working in university because their work isn't necessarily collections-based. At the same time, we're putting a huge pressure on our collection managers because now they have to be not just handling and numbering specimens, they have to become information technologists as well. So the museum structure is migrating, and we're getting all sorts of crazy new data. These are things called ARMs. We put these at the bottom of the Caribbean, nail them into the reef, come back a year later, scrape the stuff off, do a mass DNA sample, and you can get eDNA samples that show biodiversity of specific places over time. It's a great way to collect data, but it's a totally new kind of collection, a new kind of data. It's museum-based collections that's using new science, but how do we map that into our existing portfolio? Here's one of Terry Irwin's students gassing a rainforest tree in the Amazon, and the millions of insects that will fall out of that tree were one of the bits of data that showed us how diverse tropical rainforests really are when they were finding that adjacent trees had totally different insect faunas in them, and that drove the species count from the world from 2 million species up to, 30, 40 million species. So new techniques of collecting things, new techniques of curating things. It's a crazy world out there. The science productivity is high in a museum context, in large part because you have so many haloed workers around. You may have a small or core scientific staff, but there are many people who want access to collections and publish on those collections. So here's in a decade, our museum published 7,800 scientific publications and described 3,300 new species. Not fast enough, but still a lot faster than I thought it would be going into the business. Coming out of a medium-sized city museum in Colorado, where we were publishing 15 or 20 papers a year and naming maybe no new species a year. We worked, many of you will know Ian Owens. He's now the head of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. He worked for me for 2 years, DC, and helped pull together our science framework. We're trying to really balance the traditional museum science needs with the museum science needs of the future. And we have not been neglecting the audience, because those 40 million people a decade keep rolling in. We've refurbished the Hall of Human Origins. We refurbished the Sant Ocean Hall to put more of an ocean conservation theme in it. We opened an education center, the Curious Education Center, which has 6,000 objects in research-grade microscopes, so kids can get down to being scientists straight away using the best equipment possible. And it's amazing, they've never broken a piece of equipment in that space. And they have really cool confocal, and the scopes they have were insane. We did a number of temporary exhibits that were working along, and one of the things I noticed was that when you have free admission, you're not using exhibits to drive attendance. So you should be pretty thoughtful about the exhibits you put there and let them soak for a long time, because an exhibit, instead of driving attendance, if you let it sit in the room for a couple of years, it'll soak up several million visitors. So when I arrived, we've been turning exhibits over every 6 months, and people were thinking they were driving attendance, which they weren't. So we said, let's just stop, let them go for 5 years. And while we were doing that, we came on some cool ideas. We realized that, even if 12% of the nation came to the museum every decade, there's still a lot of people who didn't. So we started some focused traveling exhibits, partnering with local libraries in small towns, particularly in red states and areas where there was very big opposition to evolution, hotbeds of creationism, and took this human origins tour to libraries in red states. And what you find again and again is when you go to a place where you think the population is polarized, if you go in with respect and information and kindness, you're greeted with respect and information and kindness, and people learn. It's a pretty cool phenomenon. We opened up, after I visited London and saw their wonderful room on the best of collections, we built a large version of that, Objects of Wonder, sort of the highlights of the collections to show more and more of the collections. And you can see we have a lot of cultural collections which have been off exhibit since we opened the American Indian Museum in 2004. And what's tremendously important to us is the fact that we hold in our collections incredible riches of many Native communities from around the world. We hold Native language dictionaries for dozens of Native American languages, for which we have the paper copy of the only dictionary of their language. And so we started a program called Recovering Voices, because one of the things that are going extinct on our planet are languages. There's 6,000 languages spoken on the planet at the beginning of the century, and you know that they're shrinking rapidly down to Chinese, Spanish, English. It's a very rapid collapse of languages. And we've encountered many groups of people where there are 3 or 4 language speakers left, and we've got the dictionary of their language. So if they want to revitalize their language, we're working with that. And this has led to, bringing many cultures into the museum and letting them speak to us on our own terms. This is a group of Maori people who came, and they're awesome people. What they did was they called a haka. You may have seen it in the rugby games. They get out and yell before the rugby games. They stopped the traffic on Constitution Avenue with a haka. Cars were backed up from us, and they were just screaming at the cars. It was fantastic. They were also trying to get me to get face tattoos, which I demurred. But what we've also been doing is taking back and reburying the bodies of Native Americans. And this, to me, has been some of the most powerful and potent work that I do at the museum. In the time I've been here, we've reburied 854 individual people. And this is a scene from Igiagig village in Alaska, where I personally buried 25 humans in their homeland. And that, to me, was like the most incredible moment. And we have a powerful relationship with this village now. They're allies. And so I look at this sort of ethical stewardship thing as something not to be feared, but to be embraced. And here's the village that comes to visit me in Washington, D.C. now. There's a strong relationship. The woman who runs the village is on our board of trustees for the museum. We also took the chance to rebuild the David H. Koch Hall of Fossils. It was the original dinosaur hall that opened in 1911 at the museum, and it was modified a few times over the 104 years that it was open. But we ripped it out, gutted it, and we rebuilt the story of the history of life on Earth, from the beginning of the planet, not to the present, but into the future. Because the real message here is that humans are part of the story of life on planet Earth. And the next 20, 30, 40, 100 years, we're all going to be alive for a lot of it, is going to be when we decide how we want to run the planet. And we've got to use the hooks that work for kids, aka dinosaurs, to get them thinking about larger issues. So this exhibit goes right into the future. This is an exhibit that talks about energy use in agriculture. It's a dinosaur exhibit. And it's been really fun to watch it go. We've embedded climate extinction throughout the exhibit. And we know from lots of museum examples, when you build a climate change exhibit, people don't want to go. They're afraid of it. It makes them sad. They're not interested. Here, it's part of the story of life on Earth. And some really insightful things happened when we built that. We realized that we didn't actually have a good climate curve for planet Earth. I mean, no one had really done the hard work of mixing the climate proxies and getting a climate curve that went much back down about 60 million years. So we actually convened 40 of the world's top paleoclimate people and said, we know there's reasons why it's hard to make a climate curve for the last 500 million years. You have different proxies, you have different time resolutions, but give it your best shot. Give us something we can actually do and use. And they did that. Here's our National Tyrannosaurus Rex. Here's our giant shark, which we built, putting in place, because awe and wonder are part of the mix. And here's that climate curve. We actually created a climate curve for the last 500 million years. And what really jumps out hard, and it's hard to see from this angle, but on that curve, the curve left, right, and the bottom is 500 years till the present. And you see it's blue in areas and red in areas. It's blue in areas where there's polar ice caps, and it's red in areas where there are no polar ice caps. So by rough estimation, for the last 500 million years, 75% of Earth history has seen a planet with no polar ice caps at all. For the last 34 million years, we've had ice caps, so we're people of the ice cap. Our climate system runs with ice caps. It's what drives our oceanic currents. It pretty much makes our planet work, the world as we know it. And yet, we are taking the climate back to a greenhouse. Like by present calculations, by the year 2100, we could have the CO2 levels that were present 60 million years ago. 80 years forward, 60 million years backwards. And we know what that looks like because we know what the fossils of that time period look like. We can actually see the future by looking at the past using climate and a well-curved curve. So it's no mystery. Science sees the future these days. Museums interpret science. Museums can interpret the future. And that's what we need to do. We need to interpret the future for very compelling stories for our vast audiences so that our societies can make choices. We've been doing a new kind of museum exhibit, ones that interpret breaking science, because breaking science is amazing if you're a scientist, but if you're a citizen, it's just baffling. What does a citizen know about the genome? This is an exhibit we did to honor the completion of the Human Genome Project, which ended in 2004. This exhibit opened in 2013. And behind the house, we built out the toolkit, the labs, the biorepositories, the collection tools, informatics, to start doing genomics of biodiversity, because that's really one of the great futures and one of the great potentials of natural history museum collections. And you heard from Harris this morning talking about the Earth Biogenome Project, this idea that it's inevitable that we will sequence the genomes of all things on Earth. And where we're going to get those genomes, you either go collect them or you go to museums. And so museums are preparing themselves to be the genomic biodiversity repositories of the future. Even if you do go collect them, they should end up in those biorepositories. So there's this linkage between what we can understand from the genomics of biodiversity, and truly that's the future medicines, the future food sources, because we have to get through this 10 billion person bump in the next 20 years as well. We have to be able to feed 10 billion people before that curve comes back down and we learn how to live in a world which has a shrinking human population. We've never done that. We've never had that experience. It's going to be hard for cultures to do it, but that's where it's going to go. Here's the Global Genome Biodiversity Network, now 83 members in 31 countries, keeping frozen tissue on ice. The goal here is to sample half of the genera of the tree of life, and really, we're trying to stay ahead of Harris, and he's trying to stay ahead of us, and that's the way it should be, right? It's a race to get the genomics of biodiversity sorted out. Meanwhile, we do other very odd things, which the point I'm making here is that I didn't show you a thing called the International Museum. I showed you a thing called the National Museum. And I think all national museums should be international museums. We should all be thinking about the planet, not the country. Because at the end of the day, it's nationalism and countries that are going to keep us from solving global problems. If we can collaborate as museums and countries, we stand a chance. And that's why things like the COP meetings are so important. It's to get calibration and agreement between countries to tackle what is clearly a global problem. And of course, things like volcanoes. At the Smithsonian, we monitor all of the world's active volcanoes. There's 1,554 volcanoes. We publish a monthly update on every single volcano, every burp and bop and everything that comes out of a volcano. Why? Because they're part of the carbon cycle. And they're also tremendously deleterious if you happen to be near one that erupts. And you can see the red spots are the danger ones. We have very active volcanoes next to very high population centers. We also are monitoring through this thing called Forest Geo, 47 50-hectare forest plots around the world. And I think we all kind of know that if you want to get the Earth in the right path, you need marine protected areas in the marine areas, and you need to keep those major forests that are alive now, the forests of the Amazon, the Congo, the boreal forests. Those big remaining forest stands are really a part of the solution, and the charge to cut those forests down is one of the things that will make us lose the race to save the planet. So super important to understand forest dynamics and marine ocean dynamics. And then this is one that made me just so delighted, because in May of 2018, we opened this exhibit called Outbreak: Epidemics in a Connected World, 18 months before the pandemic started. Remember, science sees the future. Museums interpret science. Tony Fauci's like, guys, we're doing so much interaction along in the wet markets, forest margins. We're seeing all sorts of new coronaviruses coming out. Our teams working in Africa described 60 new coronaviruses in bats. We used the coronavirus as the logo of our exhibit 18 months before the pandemic started. We had no idea there was going to be a pandemic called COVID-19. We had no idea when it would start. We just knew that the chances of a pandemic happening soon were soon enough, and pandemics had lost their currency in the social memory because the last big one that really mattered was 1918, and most people were dead from that. They might have a recollection. My grandfather got sick from the pandemic, but he survived, and I'm here to talk about it. But, it's one of those oddball things where we'd forgotten it, just the way we'd forgotten about what the word tsunami meant until 2004 at Banda Aceh. Like, these things come, but if you don't remember them, you don't think about them. And there's things you can do to prevent outbreaks from spreading. But this time we had stopped making temporary exhibits. I said, we're going to put this exhibit, let it stay for several years. And furthermore, let's give it away for free. So we created a version that could be printed out at any scale. You could either print out the actual panels, or you could print it out in paper. If you had money, you could print out a panel, paper. You could print out the 3D models themselves. It's basically an exhibit in the box. Anybody could have it. And by the time the pandemic started, this exhibit was in over 200 venues in 40 countries in 11 languages. Free exhibits in those places about the pandemic before the pandemic started. And that to me is like a really good example of what museums can do and what the National Museum can do. It's something international. It's something free because you're of the nation. It's something that takes advantage of the knowledge of science, which can see the future. And it's something that helps people think about the world that they live in. And then we all got smacked by COVID. And it was ironic because we were closed for 461 days and I couldn't let anybody into the exhibit about the outbreak exhibit. That's all right. Several million people had already seen it before the museum closed. So it's been a real eye-opener for me to come to Washington, D.C. and experience a national museum that has heft and scale and deep collaborations. Just show you the National Mosquito Collection, which has grown from 200,000 specimens to almost 2 million specimens in the last decade, because there are 3,270 mosquito species out there, and they all save one or two are disease vectors. And we're working very closely with the Walter Reed Biological Unit at which is the Army's medical unit, because they lose more soldiers to mosquitoes than they do to bullets. Always have. Disease has always been the biggest killers of soldiers in the field. And so they're pivoting their work now to ticks, and our tick collection is growing. Who wants a tick collection? But it turns out there's like 1,200 species of ticks, and we all know that ticks are migrating up into higher latitudes and becoming more and more of an issue for people. That's just one example of the embedded federal science that's happening. And I'll close by just sort of talking a little bit about, okay, how do you move forward in this space? I mean, there's clearly a bunch of very interesting initiatives happening here, but how do you drive strategy at the Smithsonian, which is not just my museum, but all these other federal agencies and all the other Smithsonian science units, of which there are 7. And what we've been really trying to do is tack close to both of those things. We are working very closely with the U.S. Government's National Climate Assessment, and have recently announced, just 2 or 3 weeks ago, the National Nature Assessment, which is a really big breakthrough because Europeans are way ahead of Americans when it comes to biodiversity. I mean, you had the scare about the insects in 2017 that Edwin talked about, but for whatever reason, in the United States, biodiversity is just not sticking as a topic. It's not perceived as a threat. Climate's perceived as a threat, although there's a lot of bipolar thinking because we're a very polarized, very political country right now where there's a lot of anti-science activity as well. So the fact that we're launching a national nature assessment is late to the game, but very important. That's going to be a pan-US government effort, and it's just getting off the ground right now. And we're going to be at the COP meeting. So we have a lot of work with our federal agency partners, which is challenging because it's not part of the day job, but the possible impact of working with the government is large. So those kinds of things reach out. And we're trying to get the Smithsonian writ large to have a more cogent science strategy as well. So it's an opportunity-rich environment. And I will say, I finished my 10th year just a week ago, and I know that because my badge expired and I couldn't get to my office. So, but it's been a wild decade, and I do really appreciate being invited to come to this meeting because I think the natural history museums have tremendous potential, but it's not going to be easy. We have to do our best shot in the next 2 decades, and you're the people running the museum right now. So, I mean, this kind of meeting, fabulous. Thank you so much for inviting me. Cheers. Thank you, Mate.
Thank you for the nice talk. I think we have room for some questions. By the way, it's a pity that the other exhibition was not in time at the right time.
Right, exactly. Just a little bit earlier.
You have questions? Yeah. Here you have one.
Yeah, thank you for a quite inspiring talk. Within the issues that you listed among the Anthropocene, one of those issues really stuck out, which was disinformation, which is, I think, the first time I see such an issue being expounded in such a way. My question is this: museums have long been a repository of information in the sense of collections, etc. Isn't it time to take museums a step forward and make them a repository of authoritative information in order to combat this kind of disinformation that is going over by ensuring that all data they publish, well, first they publish all the data they have, and then ensure that they become the authority to which one can refer back, at least in this particular field, in order to combat this disinformation which is so widespread now.
Well, it's interesting because in polls done in the United States, Natural History museums in general have a lot of trust left. But they're one of the few organizations that do. The media has lost most of its trust by becoming polarized, and certainly politicians have very little trust. So you have this situation where people do trust us, and that's a very rare and wonderful thing, and you have to think about what might affect that trust. But I also think the second part, which is so much of the information we have is purely scientific information, and it does need to be translated to even policymakers, but certainly needs to be translated for the public to digest it. And I think that's the tool of museum programs, museum exhibits, museum educational efforts, museum websites. I didn't mention television shows, but those are pretty powerful tools as well. Television is getting very fragmented, but still in the States, you can do a Nova, which is a PBS show, and see 2 or 3 million viewers, which is not bad. If a museum's seeing 5 million viewers a year, and you can get 2 million or 3 million people for one evening. So I think that those are the modes, but I think we have to be speaking about these topics, and traditionally we have not been, right? We've been talking about more traditional topics, like evolution, for instance, which was quite controversial 30 years ago when American creationism was on the rise, and museums were saying you can't use the E word. That's pretty much gone now. We don't get much kickback on evolution-related topics, but now it's more topics that are really about global change, the rate of change, those kinds of things. So I totally agree that we should take advantage of our trusted position and try and find outlets that don't erode our credibility. I think it's super important for museums to stay apolitical and nonpartisan, especially in our country where you could easily make a mistake and suddenly you've lost half of your audience. You want the whole audience. You want to assume that the country is a bell curve and that it's the noise that makes it appear bimodal. And again and again, we've seen this when demagogues get in play. They strive and divide countries. Whereas you go talk to people, and usually they're sort of more near the middle. So I think trying to own the middle is a really important opportunity for us, and strive to be apolitical. And that's, often our staffs tend to be tilted towards one way, and it's important to make sure that your staff doesn't suddenly get you in the middle of a political argument you don't want to be in. You want to keep it science first. Science tells the story well.
Thank you. That was one of the most compelling presentations of anything I've seen in a long time, and it was particularly interesting for me as an American. And you came at the end. You had the pandemic exhibit, and I guess it makes me think about impact of a museum, an institution like this. Can you talk about what you think the impact was, broadly speaking, of having done that exhibit? That's what museums do. They do an exhibit with all of the outreach and education and everything else that went with it, which we didn't see all of. What kind of impact did it have when the moment came, or as the moment came, where you would hope that it would have had a positive impact? What was it?
Yeah, that is the back and dark side of having no entrance fee for the museum. So we don't even know who our visitors are at all. I mean, people come and go, and we look at them and go, well, there's a MAGA hat and there's a burqa, you can and there's some older people and some younger people. We can kind of estimate our audiences, but since we don't charge them, we don't have a point of contact or point of sales, we don't have a membership program. So they flow literally through like water, and we don't know, by and large, the impact of our work. I would say that probably is one of the greatest weaknesses of being a national museum that's free is we don't know. We have what I call the long fuse, which is I'll run into people who are 45 years old and running a major science organization. They'll tell me, when I was a kid, I came here and saw this exhibit and it made me do this. But that's not data. That's just anecdote. And so that's one of our biggest challenges. The uptick of the ongoing requests for more versions of those exhibits. Again, those go to places where we don't know who goes to them or how people interacted. So I think we're operating on faith, to be perfectly and bluntly honest. I don't know, even if you're a museum that did have a better sense, getting impact is a hard thing to get. Because it's an informal science education. Our audiences are mainly families who are there socially. They're learning across multiple generations. And I certainly get lots of people who write me and say that was an amazing experience. But I wish I could tell you that we saved X hundred lives because of our pandemic exhibit. I can't say that. But I can say that millions of people saw it.
Thank you, Kirk. You show us a very nice pile of different kind of museums, starting with a personal museum, which I love. Everybody almost has his personal museum at one moment of his life. And you ended with the National Museum. But I just wonder if time is not come to invent a kind of international museum. And this could be part also as a solution regarding the cultural reckoning that you speak about too. And this is something that doesn't exist so far. But I just wonder if it's not time to start to invent that. What do you think about?
You know, I was just having a conversation on the way over here on the bus, which was this realization that one of the ways to make these things work is to plug the science and collection staff together and to plug the directors together. And then you have a strong tie. And I think it is maybe time for the large museums of the world to start thinking about what can we do together that's both additive and perhaps multiplicative. And I don't, it's this whole idea of the global collection, but really the global museum. And there are some, examples I can think of. We certainly during the pandemic, when we suddenly discovered Zoom and Teams, and it was like, wow, we could talk to a crowd across the world. And we found we could do easy lectures from our desk. This concept that a scientist at any museum is a scientist at every museum, it's a cool idea because we only have like our 60 experts, and you got your 30 experts, you got your 40 experts. They add up to a lot of experts. But if there was a central node where those people could be speaking, your scientists could be talking to our audiences and vice versa, you might be able to very easily create some communication pathways, direct pipelines to real scientists, which, most people in America have never met a real scientist. That's part of the reason they don't understand science is they don't have the experience of talking to a scientist. I think it's generally true. I don't know how many scientists in the world. There's probably tens of millions, but compared to the billions of people, scientists are relatively rare beasts. And then they're just basically people who understand that new knowledge can be grasped. And that's a pretty compelling concept. So I think that making our scientists assets in a more distributed way is just one example. But I think it's well worth having conversations about how we can start talking about a global museum network that has some impact. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much for this inspiring talk. One thing made me especially curious when you spoke about money. I understood that it's just floating in your institution. So how much is the overall budget and how much do you spend for exhibitions?
Yeah, so on a given year, I spend between $100 and $120 million. And most, like I'd say about 80% of that comes from the federal government. Now, what's happened over the years, of course, is in a world where money comes freely, people don't know how to deal with money. It's the same like the visitors. When visitors come freely, you don't understand how to deal with visitors because you don't think about them, because you don't have to worry about them. The same with money. So I find that in my organization, many people don't think about money very much, and therefore they overcommit themselves, and so they appear to be poor to themselves, even when we're getting $100 million a year. So it's an interesting thing, but one of the great advantages of the Smithsonian is that it can raise philanthropic dollars. It's not a federal, we're sort of a quasi-federal agency. Technically, we're a federal trust instrumentality because we were started with a bequest from James Smithson. So we've always had private funding as part of our portfolio. So we can raise money, and now we're in the era in the United States of very large philanthropic gifts. The wealth difference has gotten so large that people are giving truly staggering gifts. We used to be talking about 9-figure gifts as like the Holy Grail, but just last year there was a couple $160 million gifts to museums. And then just 2 months ago, a single individual gave Stanford $1.6 billion to start a school of sustainability. So there's a lot of money available from individuals in the United States. And I was walking around Madrid last night looking at these beautiful buildings and thinking, it's always amazed me that philanthropy has not been a huge part of the European package. It's much more of an American thing. But that's a challenge for you to crack, because if people really do care about the future of the planet, There must be some way to tap into that source, because I think many of the European museums are limited by how much money the governments are willing to go. Now, obviously, you have the EU and these great shared packages, but it does seem that just because philanthropy hasn't worked in the past doesn't mean there aren't some opportunities in that space. I know there are tax issues. I know there's all sorts of reasons why it doesn't work, but we've seen an incredible uptick in the States on these really transformative, huge gifts. I haven't gotten one yet, but I'm still working on it. The Smithsonian got a $200 million gift recently. So, I mean, these are real money that are additive. And I think the key thing is you need the really compelling argument. And, I probably need to have more knowledge about my impact for that argument to be compelling. I mean, I think it's a very fair statement. But I think that there's a moment where philanthropy is another part of the solution package, because of the way that finances have gone in the last couple of years.
Thanks, Kirk.
Cheers.